This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the novelist and writer Jarett Kobek, who is famous for his novel The Future Won't Be Long and I Hate the Internet. He's also written a book about a very interesting sort of art movie, which is called Invocation of My Demon Brother by Kenneth Anger. Also, the filmmaker, probably most famous for Scorpio Rising, and even more famous perhaps as the chronicler of a decadent, slightly invented Hollywood called Hollywood Babylon. So thank you so much for joining me.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So I kind of wrote you a fan letter fairly recently because primarily I read two books that you wrote, How to Find Zodiac and Motor Spirit, The Long Hunt for the Zodiac Killer. And we're just going to touch on these very briefly at the beginning because I think these are two books which I kind of consumed one after the other in sort of in a 24-hour period, I think. And this is sort of the disease of the Zodiac. Is it's sort of like the whole point of the book, of your first book on this, is don't get obsessed with this stuff. And then the second book is I'm obsessed with this stuff.
Yeah, the way that I would describe the two books is that if they were written by two different authors, the author of Motor Spirit would despise the person who wrote How to Find Zodiac. It just so, and How to Find Zodiac, for people who are not familiar with it, is an attempt to disprove that someone is the Zodiac killer whose name came up in the writing of Motor Spirit, which was meant to be sort of Motor Spirit was never really meant to be about the Zodiac killer. It was meant to be a cultural history of California in the 1970s. The Zodiac killer happens just through circumstance to bracket the 1970s quite well. In the process of doing the research, I came up with what I believe to be a credible candidate for Zodiac. How to Find Zodiac is me desperately trying to disprove that this person is Zodiac and failing notably. But we should say my failures are not the limits of the universe. There are many, I'm sure there's some way out there to disprove it that I just couldn't think of. But no one else has thought of it either. So
I think the appeal of both the book and, as you say, that wider context which the first book deals with is just this idea of how attractive conspiracies and pattern recognition are in our culture. And we see that even today. And that's why when I read your book, I felt it was very relevant not only to the 70s, and I discovered a lot about the 70s, but it was also felt very pertinent to now.
yeah, Zodiac as a topic has historically evidenced well, Zodiac is sorry, let me say that a different way. You can look at Fincher's film, which, you know, I think most people have now come around to the opinion that that may be the last mainstream American film that really mattered. Um, and what's that film about? That film is about the fictional Robert Graysmith getting addicted to information. And I think Fincher had the bad luck of that film coming out just a little bit too early. It wasn't clear. When did it come out? 2007, I think, 2008.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
I don't think anyone had really wrapped their heads around where this was going. And maybe even Fincher didn't. Sometimes writers and directors will create a work without even knowing exactly what it's about. And then 20 years later, everyone's like, oh, fuck, classic. That's us now. And so Zodiac has always had a very obsessive, from the beginning days. And it's one of the things in Motor Spirit, when I was doing the research, it became clear that most of the people who were the early proponents of this information theory, this conspiracy theory, this zodiac as all-encompassing thing, seemed to be insane people, uh, methamphetamine addicts and criminals, and possibly people who are all three at once. And it's like, that's not a terrible portrait of America in 2025. Tweakers, nutcases, that is where we are right now. So, yeah, it's always been a place where people could invest a lot of ideas that may or may not have any relationship to reality.
Isn't it maybe about that moving into the mainstream that at a certain point the people who we were thinking, okay, in the 1980s, if you believed in the Bermuda Triangle or I mean, there's a very 80s conspiracy for you. Nobody ever talks about the Bermuda Triangle anymore. But if you believe in that and all that sort of stuff, ghosts and telekinesis and um, uh, various conspiracies and plots, then you were very much on the margins. Whereas nowadays, you're probably in the Oval Office.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the place where you can see that the most is the 40 Times,
Mm.
which had a great 90s. The 90s for the 40 Times were banging. Gray aliens were everywhere. No one believed that crop circles were done by two guys named Doug and Dave. And then the transition into the internet was, and I think has been, really rough for that magazine because turns out if you're sensible, the internet has disproved a lot of it. And also, it's not really Fortean anymore. It's mainstream. If you believe that Fortean has a kind of cultural connotation rather than is used as an adjective simply to indicate weird clouds and fish, falling from the sky. But if you look at the Fortean Times now, it has been because that stuff no longer is on the fringes, the Fortean Times has transformed into a very odd British heritage magazine that operates almost entirely on the conceits of the construction of folk horror. Every two issues, there's a cover story that's like, hey, here's an anthology series from 1975. And wasn't it weird? And didn't it look crazy? Or, here's a cover story about, I don't know what they were called in Britain, but here's a cover story about public service announcements for children.
Oh yeah, we had safety films for
Yeah,
children, which were all about
yeah,
kids falling on railway tracks and were brutal.
yeah, yeah. I just saw one the other day about not playing next to ponds, I think. And there's a Grim Reaper voiced by Donald Pleasance. It's incredible. If that were a whole film, it would be amazing. But in any event, I think you can see the creep of all of that into the mainstream, accompanied by actually the internet having a really deadening effect on that stuff for give or take, relatively sensitive people or sensible people, um, you can see it in the Fortean Times that like that is a magazine which, by the way, I adore and could not be happier is in the world, but it has it's at a real weird place because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's true what you say about the 90s. I forgot, of course, X-Files, M. Night
Yeah.
Shyamalan. You have this whole intersection of. I mean, it's that thing of what Coleridge called the suspension of disbelief as well. Was it Coleridge or De Quincey? Anyway, it was one of those guys talked about the suspension of disbelief, and
I think De Quincey.
yeah, I think so. I was halfway through
Yeah.
Coleridge, and I got my romantics mixed up. Um, it's like this idea, and I think this will take us a little bit to via Charles Manson to the invocation of my demon brother. Um, I kind of want to believe in some of this shit, and
Hmm.
it's but the sensible bit of me goes, okay, yeah, it'd be great if this stuff actually, to some degree, there was a there, but I can't really, but I still enjoy reading about it. I'll still
Yeah.
go there, but I'm not going to go there. I can't fool myself into actually believing any of this.
Yeah. It'd be nice. I mean, it's interesting though, because I think we're entering, and maybe this also is reflective in how nutty the mainstream has gotten. We're entering a new phase where the proliferation of information and video in particular is so profound that even if the shit were all real, how would you ever be able to tell?
Mm,
If somebody found Bigfoot or a UFO and it was a really credible real video, would anyone believe it? Would anyone even be able to tell it apart from the credible fake videos that proliferate on YouTube? Probably not. So it may be that there was definitely an interesting moment, and I've been thinking about it a lot with the internet in the 20 teens, where there was a real contraction and a real burning through of culture.
mm.
I think that moment is over, and we're now in some new, ill-defined moment where everything is simultaneously true and false.
I,
And how do you tell the difference?
it's like students at university are submitting keystroke data with their essays to prove that they typed it in. So
Yeah.
it's almost like you have to, and then that we're only weeks away from an app which will provide you with keystroke data as
Yeah,
well
yeah.
as your essay. So it's an
Yeah.
arms race of falsity and reality.
Yeah, but I think there is an opportunity in there. If, and most people can't do it. I hope I can. Maybe I can't. There is an opportunity in there for the value proposition of unique work. I'm not quite sure how one gets that over, but it has been unconsciously and now quite consciously post the development of generative AI. We are entering a world in which everything is going to be pink sludge. All the writers and to some degree, these people had disappeared anyway. But if you were the writer who could be reliably called upon to produce a 600 to 1,000 word blurb about anything for a print publication and then subsequently, say, a lifestyle website, you're fucked. That's gone. You're done.
Yeah.
But if you're the person who is capable of engaging with things in a very different way and is coming from it from a perspective that AI could never generate, I actually suspect, and it won't be immediate because everything is still washing out, but in 5 to 10 years, that's all people are going to want because the uniformity and the sameness of the AI production is going to become omnipresent. And so my suspicion is for people actually like yourself who wrote a remarkable book on Terrence Malick, like that stuff is going to have a bigger value proposition than it might have had for the last 15 years because the internet had this quality where, some random person could have a blog. I mean, remember blogs? They could
Yes.
be they could be bloggers. And, around 2010 to 2014, there would be people who had these hyper specific blogs where it would be like, I only chronicle self-released loner folk albums. And that, like the albums were terrible, but the blog and the obsession was really quite remarkable, and was probably better than any book on even remotely adjacent topics. That is gone. And so I think the value proposition for people doing that kind of work in a purchasable format probably is about to rise or is rising. And people just, you know, I'm drifting now into it's early in the morning for me. I'm not on Rome time.
A
So
long live the niche is what I'm hearing.
yeah,
Get yourself a niche and sort of dig deep
yeah,
because otherwise, as you say, it's going to be blurbs. Blurbsville is gone, and copy,
yeah,
what we call
yeah.
copy in the trade, you know, which I do. I write copy sometimes, and that is about to dry up.
Yeah. I mean, I made the curious career choice starting in maybe 2018 that I would write no copy, that the books would just come out and have the least helpful descriptions ever. And or really maybe the copy wouldn't even describe the books.
What was behind that decision?
I think every book ends up selling exactly as many books as it's going to sell. And there's a kind of logical fallacy in that assertion, but we'll go with it. I don't think, I think everything that we do to sell books or that publishers want writers to do to sell books, I don't think it works at all.
Mm.
I think, and so the experiment, which weirdly has been okay, was like, well, what happens if you just stop trying to sell? What happens if you put this stuff into the world and you're just like, whatever, I don't care if people read it or if they don't read it. We'll see what happens. And the three books that have been done like that have all been really successful. The two Zodiac books, and then I did a biography of the SoundCloud hip hop artist XXX Tentacion. And that had like over the summer, kids on TikTok found it like 6 years after it had been published, and it sold so many copies that it sold like thousands and thousands and thousands of copies just off of these kids making videos of themselves. And it's like, I've never done any advertisement. There's no copy. The book doesn't have a web page. So,
That's perfect.
so
That's
I, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not just like for your listeners and for you, this idea of the value proposition and doing something other than pink slime is not just, a man with no hair hoping the future will be kind. It's actually based in some anecdotal experience.
I love the idea as well of just not doing something that everybody else does. It reminds me there's a scene
Yeah.
in Seven Psychopaths where someone says to Christopher Walken, "Put your hands up," and he goes, "No." And they say, "What do you mean?" Yeah, the guy's got a gun on him. What do you mean, no? I've got a gun. And he goes, "I don't want
Well,
to." What are you going to do? I don't want to. I'm not
yeah.
putting my hands up.
Well, I mean, the people who published this Invocation book, the filmmakers Nick Tody and Rachel Kempf, they co-directed a film. They're married, and not that that matters, but why not?
It adds
Um,
color. It adds a detail to the
yeah,
story.
so Nick and Rachel were in LA, and then right before the pandemic, or maybe right at the beginning of the pandemic, they moved out to Kirksville, Missouri, which mostly I think is known for having some relationship to the birthplace of or to the birth of eugenics in the US.
Excellent.
Um, and they made a film called It Doesn't Get Any Better Than This. And, and for reasons not related to the film itself, they came up with this idea, which was we're going to tell people in advance that the film will never be released on physical media or streaming. That the only way you can see the film is if you come to one of these screenings. And the budget for the whole film was they bought like du a drug addict duplex in Kirksville, which, I don't think property prices are particularly high. And they shot a found footage film that stars themselves as themselves in this duplex that had been helpfully set designed by a bunch of tweakers over the last 10 years. And A, the film's great, but B, it's been this enormous success. They have a real sleeper cult hit. Like it was at Toronto. You can, whenever they have screenings, huge numbers of people show up. And it's because it's them not doing, it's them refusing to do exactly like you said, refusing to do all the things that people do. And also because I think all anyone wants is an experience out of the house, but it's really hard to justify in a worsening economic situation. It's really hard to justify going to a film if you know it's going to be on streaming in 20 days.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love watching films at the cinema. I love watching films at the theater and all that sort of stuff. But on a rainy, cold night, if the choice is there, I'll stream it. I'm not precious about that experience.
Yeah.
Um, Listen, let's move on to Invocations of My Demon Brother. I hadn't seen this film until I read your book, and I read your book before I watched the film, because that's the sort of choice I make because that's in the history of my film watching. That was frequently how I watched films. I would always, because it took ages for films to get to where I lived, so I would read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep long before I saw Blade Runner. And so was very disappointed that it wasn't wasn't similar to the book at all.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm a huge Philip K. Dick obsessive, and I really dislike that book, and I also really dislike that film.
Well, don't you mention the book in I think I read your thoughts on the book somewhere.
Possibly.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it might even be an invocation because I think there's a I always have this idea that the most interesting elements of the book were like Mercerism and Johnny Friendly and the Mood Organ
Mhm.
and all those things don't turn up in the film. It is no, it isn't his best book, but I
I
think it's
I'll tell you the thing that I really like about that book, which is
go.
not a good quality. You can you if you read it, you can tell, you can feel him. So my impression, and this might be wrong, and please, if you're the Dick Estate, consider me an idiot because I know they can be contentious. Um, my feeling is he woke up every day and popped amphetamines and then wrote as the amphetamines wore off. And you can actually feel the cycle in the
Mm.
book where there will be points, there'll be paragraphs and sections where it's really, really high. And then and then it slowly comes down over the next 10 or 20 pages. That part's amazing. I don't know. I'm not that big of a fan of that book, but
Well, let's put a pin in that. We might come back to it, but
sure.
let's talk about Kenneth Anger. And I mean, he's a filmmaker. I mean, I'm aware of him as the author of uh, Babylon Hollywood or Hollywood Babylon.
Hollywood Babylon.
There you go. A book which I remember being on the shelves of the library, and I would sort of leaf through surreptitiously because there were a couple of boobs in it, I think, when I was like 12 or 13 years old. Um, uh, I mean, tell us for the sake of our listeners, and also for me, because my awareness of him is relatively limited to sort of, as I
Sure.
said, those things I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, how would I summarize? Well, the way to summarize it is America had a kind of avant-garde underground filmmaking scene. I mean, it still does, of course, but it was quite different then because it was an idea that was very new. And starting in the late 40s, Anger, who grew up in Santa Monica and went to, I believe, Beverly Hills High School, um, he was this kid who was hanging around a cinema club with another filmmaker named Curtis Harrington, who probably, I think, these days is most famous for a film he did called Night Tide, uh, and who later became a real Hollywood journeyman. But anyway, Anger and
Night Tide with
Harrington
a
and
very young
other
Dennis Hopper, right? Is that the
Yes, yeah, giving one of his least convincing performances. I mean, I love that film. I think that film is really an amazing period piece, but and but it is not good. People pretend it is. It's not. Um, but he started making films very, he being Anger,
yeah.
started making films very, very early in his life. And by the time he was 20, he had made a masterpiece called Fireworks, which there's a lot of different ways it can be described. People certainly have described it as a landmark of gay sexuality represented in films. It's also just someone who has an unbelievable mastery of editing and pacing and the techniques of cinema. Excuse me. Um, and he sent it over to France, I believe, and Jean Cocteau took took notice of it. Anger then went to France and was at the Cinémathèque Française an assistant to Henri Langlois for about 10 years. Somewhere in there is when he started writing Hollywood Babylon. I'm not I can't remember where it first appeared, like some of those articles first appeared. He was also making some of his lesser European works that are all still, all of his films are interesting. Um, his mother died somewhere around 52. He came back to LA. He shot a film called Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which is sort of a collection of every person who is really in the avant-garde in California in that moment, dressed up in different costumes. He then went back to Europe. He came back in 63 or yeah, 63, maybe 62. In any event, at the beginning of the 60s, he comes back. He's in New York and he shoots a film with Brooklyn biker kids that becomes Scorpio Rising, which again, like all of these films, what I think I'm missing in this historical summary is they were made for nothing. They were
Mm.
made for peanuts, whatever the cost of film stock was, and whatever the cost of like emotional blackmail you had to enact to get people to do things on films. But if you watch them, Anger, they look like Hollywood films. That's the best way I can say it. And I don't mean in sort of the insipid way. I mean in the this is a this is craft. This is a crafted object that has a kind of technical excellence that we do not associate with underground filmmaking of the period. Um, so Scorpio came, and Scorpio also, I should mention, is sort of unjustly famous as being the first film scored to popular music.
Mm.
Um, the person who actually did that was a guy named who was actually the first was a guy named Bruce Connor, who made a film, fantastic film called Cosmic Ray, which is a montage piece that is scored to a Ray Charles performance off of a live album from 1950 something. But Anger got that reputation because Scorpio is in color, because Scorpio is so beautiful in a way that Cosmic Ray isn't, that he was the person who introduced this idea of using pop music to cinema, to score cinema. And then he was both lucky and cursed that Andy Warhol came along, because underground cinema before Warhol, it was not popular. And then
It was
Warhol,
underground.
yeah, and it also was the 60s and et cetera, et cetera. But by the end of the decade, Scorpio, Anger and Warhol were the high popes or the high priests of underground filmmaking. Anger primarily on the strength of Scorpio Rising, Warhol primarily, but not exactly, on the strength of Chelsea Girls, but also My Hustler had been a kind of, people had really seen My Hustler. And Warhol, of course, represents the opposite of everything that makes anger. Warhol was, I mean, I think they were both geniuses and both genius filmmakers, but Warhol's primary technique was let's find a bunch of freaks and I'll just turn on the camera. And he had a sync sound camera after about 65. So there's no editing really. It's
Mm.
just here is a document of a certain amount of time, and I have told these people on drugs that they are these characters. Maybe they'll pretend to be these characters. Maybe they won't pretend to be maybe they'll forget halfway through. But that's the film. The film starts where the real starts. The film ends where the real ends. And let's see what it is. Uh, it could not be more different from Anger, but his real Anger's real heyday was in the 60s. There's no question. This is when he was at his cultural prominence and the film that he ended up making. And we can talk about this when I'm done with this very long summary. Anger made Invocation of My Demon Brother in art 67 to 69. And it was supposed to be a film called Lucifer Rising. He was living in San Francisco. It was supposed to be a love vision of the love generation. That did not happen. Chaos ensued because with Ken, chaos always ensued. He decamped to England, London, and was in like the Indigo Arts Gallery scene with Robert Fraser and the great, inestimable, lovely John Dunbar, who introduced Yoko Ono to John Lennon. And he shot quite a bit, or actually all of what would eventually become Lucifer Rising in about 70, 71. And a guy named John Gottwe, I may have pronounced his last name wrong, recently released a very, very good book about the making of Lucifer Rising, which can only be in an edition of 1,000. So anyone who wants it should get it now because I don't think there are that many left. Um, but then Anger couldn't finish the film. It didn't get done until 1980, 1981. And the amount that the culture had changed between 1970 and 1981, all of this weird hippie 1970s Camden gearhead looking shit just looked crazy out of place. So the film has never really made any sense. It's also theoretically his most religious work because Anger had a reputation that he cultivated as being a practitioner of Aleister Crowley-esque magic. So he releases it and again, Lucifer Rising is one of the films where I think you can really see how profound his technical capacities were. That film was not, he had more money for it, but that film was shot for the price of a car commercial, maybe half the price of a car commercial. And it's all encompassing. It's like location shoots. It's shot in England. It's shot in Finland. It's shot in Egypt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he stopped making films. That was it. And then somewhere around the year 2000, he started releasing weird video edits of varying quality. One of the last film he made that's a genuine masterpiece is a thing called Mouse Heaven, which is entirely about Mickey Mouse toys. That thing is amazing. The rest of them, it's like, you know, they're on a varying spectrum. But he spent the 90s and the 2000s not exactly as a forgotten figure, but not but basically really skint as skint as possible. And then somewhere around his 80th birthday, started to have a little bit of a career renaissance which would have been around 2007, 2008. Anyway, that's a very long description of anger, but I think that hits most of the major points.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that. I think that's really important. And it sort of
And I,
gives us a sense of who he is. And I mean, he's funny because it's that thing of being someone who's famous. So you kind of just assume that they're commercially set up because you assume that they could just go on a circuit and, tour or whatever as themselves and they'd be taken care of by the arts establishment, so to speak.
I mean, to some degree, he was. I mean, the thing that is not in the summary that I just gave, Anger is a very complicated figure because it is impossible to watch the films and not suggest that this is a person, certainly who is a prodigy. Like, find another film made by a 20-year-old that's as astounding as Fireworks. You'll never find it. And when you watch the later works, Scorpio, Inauguration, etc., it's also impossible to deny that this is a person who has an innate genius for cinema. The problem is that he was also crazy as a bedbug, and he was crazy for decades. And I knew Ken. I spent a lot of time with him, and he was always. I may be the only person who never got abused by him. He was always very pleasant to me because, for whatever reason, people tend to be on their best behavior around me, which makes life very boring. um because you'll hang out with people and you'll have like you'll spend an hour talking about Daniel Defoe, and then somebody later will be like, yeah, that guy drank my piss. And it's like, what the hell, why, what did I get? But so he was always nice to me, but he was one of the most self-destructive people who ever lived. The amount of opportunities that he blew or couldn't take advantage of, the amount of people that he alienated,
You
the
describe a screening in the book where he basically sort of gets on stage and starts trashing the place.
yeah, in at the height of my association with him, I ended up seeing Spider-Man 3, the Tobey Maguire film, with him twice in a day. And the first time he was just loud. Ken was bipolar. And when he was up, he was really up. And when he was down, you might get 10 words out of him in 5 hours. And most of the time, he was probably somewhere in the middle. But we we saw Spider-Man. He wanted to see Spider-Man 3, which he had already seen, by the way. And he was like, he spent the entire film, the first screening, talking about it being a product of Crowleyite religion and like yelling and all of this weird shit. And trying to convince me that the actress who plays Aunt May, was like a high priestess in the OTO or something like that. And like when Spider-Man was swinging webs, he'd be swinging web. It was an awkward moment. Then he was like, "We have to see it again." And at first, I was trying to talk my way out of it. And I was like, "What's wrong with me? Why would you say no to this?" So he bought a ticket for another screening, and this one was in the ArcLight Cinerama Dome. And then he wanted to go back to his apartment. I was like, we're gonna be late. And he's like, no, we're gonna go. So we went back to his apartment, and he changed into, famously for years, he had New York Rangers jerseys that he would take the R and the S off, so it would just say anger across his chest. So he changed into one of those, and then he also was like, let's bring this wooden Indonesian demon to the
Yeah.
screening.
Yeah, no,
And
that makes sense. I was wondering why you hadn't already done it for the first screening, actually.
yeah, well, no, because he made me pick him up at the Chateau Marmont. And then I was driving him home on Sunset, he's like, we went by the arc light. He's like, we've got to see Spider-Man. So we go back and, there's chaos getting in because the arc light at that time, which it's now closed, was one of those cinemas, was one of the first cinemas where they didn't let you come in if you were late. And we were about 10 minutes late. Ken just bum rushed through past the usher, took our seats, which were middle seats at the very front row. And the Arclight Cinerama Dome was a Cinerama screening originally in the 60s. So it's very low
Right.
to the earth, and our seats were really blindingly close. Anyway, about 20 minutes before the film ends, I look over and Anger has gotten on his back and has the wooden demon. He's pushing it with his feet down to the bottom of the screen. And again, like I said, because this was like a Cinerama screening in a geodesic Buckminster Fuller dome, it's only about a foot off the ground, and the demon is about maybe a foot and a half high, 2 feet high. So he, on his back, just sort of scoots himself and the demon down to the bottom of the screen. And then once it's at the bottom of the screen, he stands up. And so suddenly, like 78, 79-year-old Kenneth Anger in a modified New York Rangers jersey just appears for everyone in the cinema. And he comes back to the seat. And then for the rest of the screening, whenever the bottom of the image turns a light color, there's just a demon head in the climax of Spider-Man 3. So
Then
yeah,
this is family entertainment as well. This is like
yeah,
lots of
and
kids
then
in
it
the
went.
audience.
Yeah, it was a midday screening on a Saturday or something like that. And yeah, so then when it ended, tons of security rushed in to the screening. Their anger, I think, has the demon. There's a very angry, upset mother who's also at the screening, also with security. At some point, she pulls uh, the demon out of his hands. He has to pull it back. Everyone gets moved outside. It seems like they're about to call the cops. And and it's something I forgot this. That month, he was the cover story of Film Comment. So I'm trying to convince them not to call the cops. And I think the way I convinced them, I was like, no, if you go into your lobby, this guy is the cover story of a magazine that you're selling in your gift shop. And it confuses them enough. And then Anger just runs away. And so then I just run and follow him, and then I drive him home. So
Oh, amazing! That sounds like in itself that could make an amazing film for that
it, it,
experience.
to be fair to him, and I should say, it was in a moment where he was having problems with his prostate and was
Mhm.
in treatment for his prostate. So maybe that interacted with everything else that was going on,
Are
because
you
that was
trying
an
to tell me that's a one-off? That there's been
No,
no
no. Oh
other
God, no, no, no. Oh,
examples of.
good Lord, no. But that week, and there's something else I write about it in the book. And the book isn't just gossip for the listeners, but
Yes.
I felt like there had to be gossip because this is the guy who wrote Hollywood Babylon. right? So how could you not have gossip? But also, like that week is also the week where Curtis Harrington died. And then, and I was not there for this, alas. Anger, who'd known, they'd known each other since they were 17. Clearly, at one point, they were boyfriends. Um, Harrington died, and they had his funeral at Hollywood Forever, which is a cemetery that Anger loved. And people like, I don't know, I don't like it, but Harrington, they had the memorial, his funeral, and like Anger showed up, I think with a camera crew. I can't remember,
That's in the
but
book. Yeah, it's definitely with a
yeah,
camera crew in the
he
book.
he essentially trashed the memorial. Like he was making out with Harrington's body when somebody was giving the eulogy. Anger couldn't stop interjecting and interrupting them, and they later, if I'm not mistaken, they had to have another non-Ken Anger invite only memorial for Harrington because of this. No, I mean Anger did this shit constantly. This is why, to get back to the point that you made maybe 20 minutes ago, this is why he didn't have any money.
Yes. Yeah.
Like he could not have been more self-destructive.
Yeah. And I mean, it's almost like he's coming from that. You mentioned the chaos earlier, an invocation of a demon. My demon brother is a really good example of that chaos being documented. There, that he just didn't stop with the chaos. The chaos wasn't sort of
Yeah.
some sort of show for him. It was in his DNA.
Yeah, to answer that question, um, invocation is the product of nothing but chaos. Um, Anger moved into this house at the corner of Scott and Fulton in San Francisco called the colloquial name for it was the Russian Embassy. It never was actually a Russian embassy, but it was one of these giant decaying mansions near the Haight, and he moved into it at the end of 66. And the idea was that he was supposed to be working on this script he had for Lucifer Rising, which no one's ever seen, but clearly was a different script than the script for the Lucifer Rising that was eventually filmed. And he started looking for a Lucifer. And I mean, Anger, lots of young men that he met ended up being called as Lucifer for at least a night. But the one, the person whom he settled on was Bobby Beausoleil. And Bobby at that time was a member of one of the much better bands in San Francisco called the Orchestra and was really talented. And if you look at him, really beautiful. Uh, he also had a kind of dual nature, which I think is why Anger really gravitated to him. Bobby's two nicknames were Cupid and Bummer Bob, and like the difference between the two will really give you a sense of his character at that time. So he had Bobby move into the house. Bobby insists, and I think there's no reason to disbelieve him, that they were not lovers. Um, and Bobby started working on the soundtrack because that was his condition. I will be in your film because Bobby was no fool. And it's something that I think because of what happened to him subsequently, people don't understand that Bobby was really, really bright.
Just
Uh,
just for our listeners, what happened to him subsequently, just in case you're not as steeped in
yeah,
lore as we are.
he fell in with Manson, and he was actually in a, I mean, it's a long, complicated story, but the short of it is he fell in with Manson and ended up committing a murder, and the circumstances around that are quite murky. And everyone has a different story, and certain people have different stories based on what decade it is that they're telling it. But he killed a guy named named Gary Gilmore, and when he got arrested for it, 10 days later, 15 days later, a phone call was made back to Spawn Ranch at the top of the San Fernando Valley, where the Manson family were living. And the Manson family came up with this idea of copycat murders that would get blamed on the Black Panthers because Bobby, after he killed Gilmore, took his blood and wrote on the wall, political piggy, and then drew a panther's paw. And, you know, one of the grimmer aspects of that is that Beausoleil had has always been extraordinarily talented. So the composition on the Panther's paw is really quite good. Um, but so the idea was, well, let's do copycat murders that are also seem like they're done by the Black Panthers, and this will get Bobby out of jail. So within, I think, 48 hours of that phone call, Sharon Tate was dead. And then the next night, the LaBiancas were dead. So that is Ken's star in 67 before any of this has happened. And so it's just Bobby and Ken in this mansion and some lodgers upstairs who I've never been able to identify. Um, and there's not a lot of filmmaking going on. There's a lot of acid. There's a lot of very odd things. But I'm not sure there was much film. Like, I'm quite certain that Bobby was working on the soundtrack there with a lot of effort and wondering when's this guy going to get out his camera. Um, and so the story that Anger would tell, which is not true, is that Bobby stole all the film from Lucifer Rising. This is a later construction. Um, what really happened is that Anger seems to have shot maybe one or two nights of stuff happening in the embassy. And then on September, I don't know, 27th, 1967, uh, that date may be wrong. There was a venue on Haight Street called the Straight Theater on Haight, and it was a performance space. The Grateful Dead played there, a bunch of bands played there. There's a whole boring story about it. Um, Bobby's band and some other bands and Ken put on a night called the Equinox of the Gods, and it was a complete disaster. Uh, Anger apparently took acid and freaked out on stage, and it did not go well. Put it that way. Like the
Didn't a
details are
journalist get injured as well at some point?
supposedly, but I mean, this is the thing about it. Um, Everyone was so high that I don't trust anything anyone says unless there's an image. I don't believe a single thing anyone says. But it was a complete disaster. Anger completely freaked out, went into the theater the next day, accused them of stealing his film, locked Bobby out of the embassy. Bobby definitely broke back into the house. He retrieved his possessions. He may or may not have taken Anger's camera. I tend to think that he did not. He may have taken some props for Lucifer Rising, or for the then Lucifer Rising. That seems plausible to me because there's later evidence of someone saying they saw it. But again, everybody was high, so who knows? Um, but at this point, Anger literally abandoned everything that he had except for his film, except for his footage that he had shot. And no one, and the footage of the Equinox of the Gods, which primarily features Anger, no one knows who shot that. For a long time, it was thought it was by this filmmaker named Ben Van Meter, who's a minor San Francisco filmmaker. He denied that he shot it, so I see no reason to assume that he did. But anyway, Anger left behind like all of his first edition Aleister Crowley books, which were quite rare even then, all of his stuff, and he just disappeared. And then he showed up on the West Coast, or sorry, the East Coast. He was like at the Pentagon protest where all the hippies were trying to levitate the Pentagon and ended up as a brilliant Norman Mailer book. And then he also went into the Filmmakers Collective or Cooperative in New York City, run by Jonas Mekas, and he burned prints of his films. That seems to be the moment where some the films that predated Fireworks, particularly two called Drastic Demise and Escape Episode, which, by the way, he had gotten into circulation and gotten reviewed when he was 17 or 18 to speak to the genius and prodigy of the guy. But he burned those films. They've never been seen before, seen again, and they were in circulation more or less up until that moment. You could get them from Canyon Cinema. Anyway, he then goes to England. He becomes like a spiritual black magic guru to the Rolling Stones. And then at some point in 69, and there's some ambiguity around this, he starts editing together this footage that was supposed to be Lucifer Rising. That's really just scraps and video or and imagery of him having an acid trip on stage in the middle of a disastrous performance. And he puts the whole thing together. And because this guy, and so it's entirely a product of chaos, it could not be more chaotic. It should not work. This does not sound like the recipe for a functional film. Somehow he gets Mick Jagger to give him a loop of a Moog synthesizer, or like a tape of a Moog synthesizer loop that the guy who sold Jagger the synthesizer made. It's not even Jagger's. It's like it could not be more. It could not be. This could not be a film made out of more trash if you tried. But Anger is a genius. So he is
There's even
able
a
to,
dead cat in there, I think.
yeah. Well, that's one of the nights that I mean, that tells you how chaotic this is. Most of the footage from inside the embassy, possibly almost all of it, is footage from apparently Anger found a dead cat outside and they decided to give it a funeral. So this isn't in the script of Lucifer Rising. This is just what he has. And it's all trash. It's all failed material, or it's Mick Jagger giving him a tape of someone else's patch on a Moog synthesizer. And Anger is so talented and so capable and understands cinema and pacing and the mechanics of cinema and how this can serve imagery and serve the experience that he puts together a film that most people would not have this opinion, but I do. I think it's his best film. I think it's the best document, not just of his capacity as a filmmaker, but also the best document of the summer of love and what it was really like.
Watching it, you can't help but feel that the sort of there's the context that swirls around it, but even if you didn't know that context, there's something that comes from within the film that is deeply dangerous and weird.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's I think that's a testament both to the moment, but also to the power of Anger as a filmmaker. How many dangerous and weird films shot 60 years ago remain dangerous and weird?
Right.
That shit wears off very quickly. Danger, cultural transgression, they're like comedy. They rot very quickly. And they usually don't make any sense 5 minutes later. And then the hope is that there's some kind of aspect of the work that transcends that stuff. You watch Invocation of My Demon Brother, and it is a it is a deeply malicious experience. I don't know how else to describe it.
I should put a link to the film in the show notes so that listeners can experience it themselves. I'm sure you'll all be very, very curious. Um, I love that description of it, that the sort of the maliciousness in there, and you know you have the satanic. I think this really goes back to what we were saying a little bit at the beginning as well. This moment where there are certain things that people choose to believe in, which I mean, I think we're going back to it a little bit with certain films where there's this sort of renewed interest in sort of the satanic scare of the 1980s, for instance.
Hmm.
Um, and yet, I'm again, I have that thing of like, I remember being at school in the 1970s and thinking, I wish the Force really existed. You know, let's just all pretend the Force is a real thing, and maybe we'll make it being that. And I still remember that cognitive gap when I lay in bed as a child, thinking, I know it's bullshit, but you know, maybe I've just happened on the truth somehow. You know, and I wonder about someone like Anger if that was sort of like if he ever lay in bed and thought, oh, I know this is all a bit bullshit, but or if he was like,
I,
I'm a true believer. This is
I mean, you hit upon a very interesting aspect of him. Now, I can only speak to my personal experience here, and other people may have had radically different experiences. But I did spend a lot of time with him. And again, one should remember that depressingly, everyone tends to be on best behavior around me. But
I've kept all my
he,
clothes on during this podcast. I just
yeah,
want to say.
again, another missed opportunity. So I heard him talk about the occult. I heard him talk about Crowley stuff. I did not find, and it's not like I'm the greatest judge of this stuff because I don't believe anything. But I had the impression that the knowledge was not that sophisticated, that perhaps he had seen something, maybe through Harry Smith, who was another American underground filmmaker who had pretensions in the direction of Crowley, that you could use the Crowley stuff as a way to really aesthetically, visually, and conceptually distinguish the films from everyone else in the avant-garde. That's the best way I can say it. That does not mean he didn't believe it, but there certainly, in my estimation, was a really mercenary aspect to it. In the best sense, not you know, like God bless any filmmaker or artist or writer who can come up with something that works that well. I mean, if you Google the guy, it's a bunch of fucking Satanism or whatever. Like it really worked.
The very
But
first letterboxed review of the film is "Hail Satan."
yeah,
Like,
I mean, it really worked. But I also think, you know, sometimes you get what you wish for, where anger was from I mean, Anger was born in 1927. He adapted remarkably well to shifts in American popular culture. There's no question. If you're the guy giving advice to rock stars about black magic in the 70s and the 60s, and you're pushing 50, you have really handled a change that other figures your age, I don't think did. Um, but he was a guy who grew up with in an America that did not believe that America had culture, that if you were someone of artistic pretenses, it was happening in France, it was happening in Paris, it's the surrealists, it's Cocteau, it's all of this stuff. And I would say all of that is in the work, especially the early work. I do not know, and I mean that literally, I really don't know. I don't know how satisfying it was if you're somebody who grew up with those kinds of pretensions to sort of turn into everybody's satanic grandpa. Like it was good because the Satanists could keep you alive, and that's fine. But what did he really want?
mm,
Did he even know by the end of his life? I don't know. But I don't think, I don't think, put it this way, and this is true of everyone, but I think in his case it was really profound. There are ideas that you have when you start doing stuff like this. And if you're lucky, maybe you get to 50% of them. And then there are people who start with an idea, with a series of ideas and assumptions and presumptions, and end up somewhere that couldn't be further from them. And where they end up isn't a terrible place by any means, but it may not be what those people were looking for in the first place.
mm, that's a really great place for us, I think, to close on. I think that's he's a figure that, because of your book and because of the what it's taken me to, I really want to sort of know more about. I already feel, having read your book, that I know a lot more than I certainly did. Um, but I just love the way that there's so much in that book which is, um, as you said earlier with Hollywood Babylon, uh, that it has that gossip and it has that cultural context around it, which ends up um, being so part of Anger's story, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say in closing, there is a very good piece about anger written by essentially my best friend, but that's not why it's good. William E. Jones, the writer, the artist, the filmmaker, who now is having real success as a painter, wrote something about anger, and mostly invocation. And weirdly, despite the fact that this is somebody I see at least once a week, they could not be more different than my book. But he wrote a short pamphlet for some kind of Warhol Foundation related thing called He Brought a Swastika to the Summer of Love. And that is a remarkable interpretation of anger as an artist and putting him in a context that could not be more different than the context that I put him in.
Mm, that's
So,
that's
and and
fascinating.
and unlike my book, it's free. You can find it. You can find it on the internet because that was part of the gig, that it's just online. But I think anyone who wants a starting point to start thinking about anger without maybe laying out the cash or the intense hyper San Francisco focus of my book, Bill's piece is really, I think, the place to go.
Yeah, yeah, and it was so interesting to see that swastika in the film as a sort of like I thought this was like the 1980s. The punks turned up with this,
Yeah,
reclaiming this Nazi imagery.
it's interesting. If there's a single flaw, and it's a minor flaw in Jones's work, is it turns out there were a lot of people at the Summer of Love with swastikas. The Hells Angels had quite a few. There's a Diggers film with somebody with a figure who's in Invocation that's shot inside his apartment and also shot with Hells Angels people. And he was a Hells Angel. And there's a shocking amount of swastikas for the flower power era
Well,
that
I mean,
one can
Manson
see.
himself was pretty much a Nazi. I mean, he was certainly Nazi adjacent if he wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know. That might be you attributing more coherence to to the figure than is necessary. Like maybe in the broadest sense, but I don't know if Manson ever had an idea in his life or even understood anyone else's.
Excellent, excellent. Well, no, I mean, not excellent, excellent swastikas and Manson, but excellent, excellent. I really thoroughly enjoyed that conversation, Jarrett.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.